morning. I guess we still are. Good afternoon already. I'm not Robert van der Roer, as announced. You probably noticed the difference. My name is Barbora Maronkova, and I work for NATO at our headquarters in Brussels. And it's my great privilege to moderate the second panel of today, and that's the panel on Afghanistan. Firstly, I would like to say a couple of introductory words, and then we will move together with our panelists into a debate. So I suggest we move from the first panel, which was mainly focused on the region, and we'll travel a little bit further out, and we'll travel to Afghanistan. As you all know, NATO will be concluding its ISAF mission end of this year. It's been 13 years of a very challenging and complex operation. But at the same time, it was also our biggest operation in terms of troops, but also in terms of nations that participated in ISAF. We have 50 nations which contribute to ISAF and stood side by side in providing security to a country that for over 3 decades was torn in conflict. However, hopefully this is not the end of our engagement in Afghanistan. At our Chicago summit in 2012, the allies have committed themselves to continue a strategic partnership with Afghanistan after 2014. And at the Wales summit, which will take place in a couple of months in September, we will be discussing also our next training mission for Afghanistan, hopefully with the signature of appropriate documents, legal documents, the BSA and SOFA, and will hopefully launch resolute support. I think for this afternoon, for this discussion, but also for the next couple of months, there are 2 major developments I would like to talk to you about. The first one is the successful first round of the presidential elections in Afghanistan. The second one is just 3 days ago, the US administration announced its commitment to the 2014 Afghanistan. So these 2 predominant themes would also reflect hopefully on our discussion. I'm not really too keen, to be honest, to discuss the title of the panel, which says Afghanistan after 2014, Progress or Downfall. I don't think we have a crystal ball at the moment to say whether there will be progress or downfall, and I believe it's also not really fair. I think only time will say, and time will show, and the historians will write about this period and will reflect about its progress or downfall. So what I would like our honored panelists to focus on is to answer 2 main questions that I prepared for them. What are the biggest challenges the country is facing? And what should be the role of the international community after 2014? And hereby, I would like to ask my panelists to come up here and join me on the stage. We have Ambassador Dr. Mohammad Daud Yaar, the Ambassador of Afghanistan to London, United Kingdom. Thank you for coming. Wherever you please. I have Her Excellency Minister of Defense of Albania, Kodheli, please.
Thank you.
The Chief of Staff of Montenegro, Admiral Samardžić.
Thank you. Ambassador, how are you?
And General John Allen. Thank you. Last but not least, another lady. So we have a very gender-balanced panel here. Pauletta, Otis.
How are you? Good to meet you.
Please join me.
Mr. Ambassador.
Good morning. Sorry.
Are you going to sit here?
I wanted to sit here,
Okay.
but I can go to the other side. So this is our panel. We have about an hour and a half before our lunch, and I would like to start with Ambassador Yaar, Dr. Yaar. I did a little research to prepare for this panel, and I found that the Asian Foundation has been doing regular polling in Afghanistan for many years. The latest polls are from 2013, and they reveal very optimistic results. 57% of Afghan people say they believe the country is moving in the right direction. The most important elements for their optimism is the progress in reconstruction, good security, improved education system, and the active presence of the Afghan National Armed Forces. However, their biggest fears still lie in insecurity, in suicide attacks, and corruption. So I would like to ask you whether you agree with the views of your countrymen, and what do you think are the biggest challenges of your country?
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Barbara, and I want to thank the Atlantic Council of Montenegro for organizing this wonderful August gathering. Well, Afghanistan has been on the under the international radar for the last 40 years almost, since 1978. For most of you, that might sound very long, but not for me. I was already an old guy in those days. So the question that you raised, before I address your question, I would like to follow the little format that I jot down before coming here. One of the questions that I read in the pamphlet that was distributed, has Afghanistan been a success? A big question. And the next corollary question of that would be, what will happen next? I think considering the fact that nation building is not a science, it's a complicated art. I think Afghanistan has been a success, and actually Afghanistan has been a great success. In 2001, Afghanistan was the epicenter of international terrorism. Terrorism radiated from Afghanistan towards the region and even beyond the Atlantic to the United States. We all are aware and familiar with the catastrophic events of 9/11. Today, Afghanistan is no more a safe haven for terrorists. By the way, I'm overwhelmed by sharing this panel with one of the great heroes of Afghanistan success, General Allen. I'm very proud of you, sir, and I thank you for all the sacrifices and the efforts that you have dedicated to Afghanistan.
Thank you.
In the meantime, since 2001 until now, dramatic socioeconomic changes have occurred in the country. We'll talk about that perhaps during this panel in more detail. But let me tell you that today, in 2001, Afghanistan was a pariah state, isolated, epicenter or center of all sorts of bad things, narcotics, tourism, smuggling, and international criminal activity. Today, Afghanistan, to the degree that we can be realistic and expect, is safe and tranquil. Three types of transitions have occurred during this period. When we started the road to today in 2001, the country was in shambles. There were less than 1 million students, all male, going on and off basis to school. The country did not have any connection with the rest of the world. The women, 50% of the population was severely suppressed. They were not allowed even to get out and wear high heel shoes. That is just a little example of how they were controlled and suppressed. Today, we have over 11 million students going to schools. 38% of them are girls and women. In the recent election that we had, 38% of the voters were women. By the way, the total number of voters who turned out to vote were 7 million out of 12 million. So it's not a bad number. On the security front, when the coalition forces entered Afghanistan, Afghanistan did not have a single soldier, lawful police or soldier. They were all militias roaming around and killing people and raping and looting and plundering the population. Today, the country, thanks to the efforts made by NATO and especially by the United States and the money that has been given to this cause, we have about 370,000 national security forces who are not perfect, but still they have made great progress, especially our military is very highly regarded among all the institutions that have been built in the country. Since almost a year now, all the security responsibilities have been transferred to Afghan forces, and the international forces are engaged in training and, to a certain degree, logistical efforts. We were supposed to have a third type of transition, which was economic transition, and we are in the process of experiencing that transition. As a student of economics, I'm sorry, General, I'm not happy with what has happened in the area of economics. We are still dependent. We are still suffering under the so-called dependency syndrome, and we have become more dependent on international finances. That does not augur well for the near future. This being said, I should again mention that nation building is not a short-term effort, it's a long-term effort. Concerning the next question, what will happen next, I think it's very clear. The options or the alternatives, to me at least as an Afghan, are very clear. Either the international community leaves Afghanistan to its own rude coping instruments, which would be perhaps catastrophic, not only for Afghanistan, but also for the region and for the whole world. The second alternative is to do business as usual, as the international community did so far, feed our national security forces and finance our budget. And that would make Afghanistan, in the long term, I can say as an economist, a burden on the shoulders of the international community. Is not a good alternative. The last alternative would be to start helping Afghanistan embark on the road to become what we call in economics a developmental state, a state that starts to take care of its finances, a state that starts to build its tax bases, a state that starts to generate sufficient employment to prevent the Taliban and other criminal groups from the recruiting ground that they enjoy, unfortunately, so far in the country. In my humble opinion, in these 13 years, we have learned a number of very important lessons. The first one, I think, would be that small countries do matter for international security and peace and prosperity. When the international community in 1992 turned around and forgot about Afghanistan, we know what happened. It could happen again if either Afghanistan or another small country in the world is ignored. We have also learned that military power is not a panacea. Military power is the necessary but not the sufficient condition of nation building. And third, I think, in order to fight terrorism, the third lesson, in order to fight terrorism successfully, those who fight terrorism and fight for liberty and other humane values, they should develop strong, honest, loyal, and efficient endogenous stakeholders. In the last area, NATO and the United States have been successful in developing that kind of stakeholder participants in the process. Women have been liberated. They take part actively in the national life of the country. And the youth have been tremendously supported to become really vocal in the national life. Because of these two groups of the society, we enjoy today in Afghanistan the most, or the freest, the most efficient, the most resilient media environment, which helps a lot to create the kind of awareness that is needed for a nation to build itself and to be a peaceful member of the international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this really fantastic picture of the past 13 years. And I hear in your voice that you share the optimism of your countrymen that were polled in this Asian Foundation polling. I would perhaps continue on what you outlined as the progress and the achievements, and I'll ask General Allen. You were the ISAF commander between 2011 and 2013. I think this was the period where we could already see the signs of the progress, increased number of children at schools, the booming media, the improved life expectancy, and many other improvements. But this was also a period where NATO announced that 2014 will be the end of the ISAF mission, which created some sort of uncertainties or uneasiness among the population. So I was wondering how would you characterize this period where you were the commander, what you felt was needed to address these concerns, and perhaps moving into the future, what would you recommend to the newly elected president in the summer?
Barbara, thank you for that important question. I'd like to thank the organizers of the To Be Secure Forum, the 2BS Forum. This is a very professionally run, very comprehensive forum, which I think addresses some really important topics that not only are of interest to the nations of this region and obviously NATO, they're of great interest to many of the countries in the world beyond NATO. This is a really important forum, and I'm honored to be part of this. And I'm also honored to share the podium today with His Excellency the Ambassador. I will say once again publicly that while by virtue of my duties I had to leave Afghanistan, you can never depart Afghanistan. The Hindu Kush and the great deserts of the West, they'll be with you forever, and I am honored still to be associated with your country and its noble people. Let me also say, because I am in Montenegro, I also have the opportunity to own this microphone for a moment, that I'd like to, as the former commander in Afghanistan and the commander of the largest NATO field force that's ever been in combat, I wanted to commend so many of the countries that are here today for their service in ISAF at the national level, for your sacrifices to put those forces in the field, and for their enormous contributions to the success of this mission. And this has been a very successful mission in many ways. And Admiral, let me just tell you that the forces from Montenegro, in particular, paired with other elements from within the region, they did marvelously well. We don't count the numbers, we count the contributions. And that contribution was very professional and made an important difference. And speaking as a former NATO commander and a general, having observed your forces in combat, Montenegro is ready to join the ranks of the NATO forces. And I congratulate you on their professionalism and all that they have accomplished. Barbara, that question that you have posed is really important. I commanded the force in Afghanistan during a really critical moment. It was a moment of transition, and the ambassador has properly mentioned a number of transitions, but this was a operational transition. And I often got the question as the commander, when are you going to shift the main effort from operations in the south to operations in the east? And I would generally respond to them with, that's the wrong question. Shifting the main effort shouldn't be from ISAF forces to ISAF forces. We need to shift the main effort from ISAF being in the lead to the Afghans being in the lead. Because every counterinsurgency campaign in which we will ever be engaged as NATO or as individual states or coalition states, you try to do three things. And the first is the interventionary forces, in this case the foreign forces, sought to blunt the progress being made by the Taliban and to deny Afghanistan being a platform for international terrorism. That was the first thing. And you have to do that. We had to buy time for the Afghan government to create coherence within the state institutions, but very importantly, to do the second most important thing, and that is to build an indigenous security capability, which ultimately would be the sword and the shield to protect the host nation. And then the third thing was to build capacity. Now, some might call it nation building, some would call it capacity building, but in any case, you have to do all three of those things simultaneously. And at some point, the main effort shifts from being ISAF in the lead to the Afghan National Security Forces being in the lead. And 12 was that really important year for that to begin, because one of the last instructions I received from Washington by the President, and I was in the presence of a great American diplomat by the name of Ryan Crocker, was that I had to send home the American surge forces, 23,000 of which were going to be sent home during the fighting season. And so it was not only the right moment in the campaign for the Afghan National Security Forces to move into the lead, the principal challenge for me as the commander. At the same time, it was ultimately important for me to recover the security forces and change the very nature of the ISAF force from being a conventional force to being more of an advisory force. Doing all of those things simultaneously in contact with the enemy was quite a challenge. And what we discovered as we began to move the Afghan National Security Forces into the lead was that they were better than we thought they were going to be. Very importantly, they discovered that they were better than they thought they were. And that confidence in 12 was reinforced by their performance in 13 and is still playing out today. And I think one of the great emblems of the accomplishment of NATO, and certainly one of the great indices of the capabilities of the Afghan people and their Afghan security forces, is how secure that recent election was. Now, we are all taking a lot of satisfaction, we should all take a lot of satisfaction in the results of the election, and the runoff will be in several weeks. But that election could not have occurred were it not for the legitimate leadership of Afghans and the Afghan National Security Forces. And while, yes, ISAF was prepared to help, ISAF didn't need to help. And so that's, I think, an enormous emblem of the accomplishments of what ISAF has done. Now, about the future, to the other part of your question. I recently was called to testify before in the U.S., we call it the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Testimony is always high adventure in Washington. And so I chose that my testimony would take the form of a letter to the President-elect, who will emerge from the runoff election very shortly. And I suggested to His Excellency, the new President of Afghanistan, and I've been asked who that's going to be, and I can say with absolute certainty it will be an Afghan, and I'll be no more specific than that. I suggested 5 points of interest that the new President should undertake. And they're roughly in priority, but the differences in priority are very difficult to detect, I think, especially as time goes on. The first is the President should sign the bilateral security agreement as quickly as possible, and with some amount of ceremony, frankly, because signing the bilateral security agreement, which was the security extension of the U.S.-Afghan Strategic Partnership Agreement, unlocks many other things. It unlocks the ability to sign the NATO SOFA, and it ties the international community, of which the U.S. is a part in the context of the bilateral security agreement, ties the U.S. and its commitment to Afghanistan. And very importantly, the President just made an extraordinarily important announcement. It has, I think, removed a lot of doubt and uncertainty in the minds of Afghans about an American commitment. And so the first thing is sign the bilateral security agreement, and in conjunction with that, Mr. President, you must take ownership of the title of Commander-in-Chief. Your forces need to look at you as the leader of the military and security forces, not just the chief executive and not just the President of the Republic. It's extraordinarily important. Second is, Mr. President, I would suggest to you that you must do all you can to protect the advances of civil society and advance even further all that has been accomplished, and in particular, the accomplishments of women in Afghanistan. It has been extraordinary what women have been able to do in Afghanistan and where they are today. But where they are today is only the beginning of where they should end up in this society. And as the ambassador said correctly, as Afghanistan moves into being a developing society, I think we all know that no developing society has ever been successful without incorporating the women of its population. And so much has been done by Afghan women who are very brave and courageous, and many of them are heroes to me, to further all of the rights of all Afghans. But in particular, Mr. President, I would suggest to you that you must protect the gains of civil society and women so that they can continue to move Afghanistan as a society forward. The third area I suggested to the President was Afghanistan must reach out to Pakistan. These two countries are in the same lifeboat. And the region is difficult. The region suffers from chaos and insurgencies. Pakistan, unfortunately, is beset by an expansion of extremism in that country and the expansion of insurgencies and terrorist groups. And the solution for both countries in terms of long-term stability, political accommodation with each other, economic opportunity is a solution together, not a solution apart. And there has been a great deal of acrimony between the two countries in the last several years, and the future for Afghanistan is tied to Pakistan, just as I now believe more firmly than ever the future of Pakistan is tied to the stability and the prosperity of Afghanistan. Fourth, to the ambassador's economic background, Afghanistan needs to effect a whole range of reforms, economic reforms, regulatory reforms, in order for Afghanistan to be fully open for business. The international community, for all kinds of useful economic reasons, needs to be attracted to doing business and investing in Afghanistan. To this point, those reforms have yet to be made. I think they're well known. It's now a matter for the new president, His Excellency, to take the courageous steps to effect those reforms so Afghanistan will be open for business. And then the fifth area, and I'll end there, is one I think is perhaps the most important, and it is that this president, because the international community, I think, will demand it of Afghanistan, this president must effect a campaign of countering corruption. The Taliban are a threat, but they are not the existential threat, I believe, to Afghanistan. Corruption is, in the end, what will deny Afghanistan the natural growth of its institutions of state and its adherence to a comprehensive set of the rule of law and commitment to human rights. And the international community can be helpful here in helping Afghanistan to deal with corruption, but if it is not dealt with decisively, we will have difficulty across all those many other areas. So for His Excellency, the next president of Afghanistan, I humbly suggest those 5 areas for his immediate attention so that we can continue to lock in Western, U.S., European, NATO commitment for Afghanistan for the future. Thank you.
Really great, and I am sure we can some of your in our further discussion. I will now turn to our regional colleagues. Minister Kodheli, Albania has been a book contributor. Hello. Let's try this again. To Albania. It is. I feel a little bit like astronauts here, but hopefully it works. So I'm sorry, Minister.
okay.
Albania has been contributing troops to Afghanistan for the entire period of ISAF, first as one of the aspirant countries and then as a NATO member. What would be your assessment of your past 13 years in ISAF and of your involvement, but also what would you recommend as lessons learned for NATO from this period?
Thank you. Hello to everybody. First of all, let me allow to thank Professor Milica, my good friend and colleague, for inviting me here, and of course the President of the Atlantic Council of Montenegro. I have to tell you, I choose on purpose to come exactly on this panel because I just came from Afghanistan a couple of weeks ago, and it was quite an impressive experience for me, you know, looking closely to what they are doing in Kabul, in Kandahar, in Spin Boldak, and General knows about what I'm talking about exactly. Very tough areas and
Right.
risky ones.
Right.
But yes, Albania was present with its troops since the beginning, with 3,614, if I'm not wrong in numbers. In general, I'm good because I'm a financial person by background. So, and it's one of the most presence compared to the number of the troops that the Albanian armed forces are having. We done this way because we really believed in that mission. We really believed in this the most important, according to my opinion, military, political, and not only organizations like NATO is. But we mostly believe in ISAF operation. It has been a very complex operation. 48 states being part of it. We learned a lot from this ISAF operation, from, you know, strategic thinking, military planning, defense budget organization, and of course modernization of efforts of allied nations to being part of that mission. But the scope was there, and we truly believe that we have done the right thing on the right moment to the right place. Of course, this even so, we right now, as we are prepared to withdraw troops from at the end of the year, it's normal to raise some questions. Was the ISAF mission a success or a fail? It's going, the post-ISAF, be a mark of success or a down fail? Are the Afghan authorities prepared to fully respond to their security and the future of their country? And let's begin the answers. I mean, I'm going to begin my answers with saying that, with answering with another question. How should Afghanistan look like if NATO did not take any action, this action? What should it be the consequences for all of us? And how far this instability were going if we were not there for so many years, with so many lives, you know, young lives spent on that mission, unfortunately. Well, I think that the answer is clear to all of us. And we truly do believe that the Afghanistan of today is totally different from the Afghanistan of yesterday. They have a lot of positive developments on the country, from the modern constitution, the government, the central government, the delivery of the elections, which was quite an important issue. And progress on the field of health, education, emancipation, involvement of females, progress on services, on agriculture, and a lot of other progresses to be stressed. Security forces is a very success story, with its 350,000 of troops that are there, willing to learn, to be trained, and to serve their country, which is, of course, not an easy job for none of them. Afghanistan economy is very equi nowadays, and it's mainly based on drug production, and this is a big deal. But they still are lack of providing, normal services and normal life to Afghani people. But we are there. We are just at the real momentum to shift from one mission to another mission. But it's not a change on mission. Mm-hmm. It's just that the target of the mission is different. Mm-hmm. So, and this is just because thanks to the real positive changes that the Afghan people are reaching day after day, and this is really extremely very important to be mentioned. Our efforts didn't fail at all. At the end of my first intervention, I will say that the change in mission and not the end of the mission have to put on our table an important discussions, not only on the next ministerial summit, which will come a couple of days later, but the Wealth Summit as well. We need to take some important decisions, like the post-ISAF mission, which now it's going to be discussed and developed under a very interesting situation, like the Russia-Ukraine situation. It looks like they are not involved, they are not mixed to each other, they are just separate things. I don't think so. NATO, it's going to deal, of course, with these issues, because these issues are, let's say, close to the safeness of our countries, NATO countries, and not only NATO countries, European countries, which are there with the goodwill, NATO or not NATO members, EU or not EU members, have a common thing that we all of us would like to deal with, the future of our kids. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you're actually making my job much easier, because you're wonderfully, doing the threads to one to another. So my questions are following in a very nice mode. So I would like to follow up on what the minister said about the Afghan National Army. Again, the Asian Foundation poll says that almost 88% of Afghans have faith and support their forces, which I think is a fantastic number, and it should help the Afghan security forces in their future job. And you also mentioned that we'll be looking for a new mission, the Resolute Support, and I will then turn to Admiral Samardžić. Montenegro has already pledged that it will support this new mission. I was wondering what are your views on the new mission, what it should achieve, and what would be Montenegro's role in this?
Dobar dan svima. Good afternoon, everybody. I would first like to thank General Allen for all the compliments to Montenegrin armed forces and soldiers, and definitely General Allen and the ambassador know best the situation in Afghanistan. But prior to answering the specific issue, let me raise some issues. I was 8 times in Afghanistan, monitoring all Montenegrin forces there, and every time I saw a progress that was going on in Afghanistan, especially in this area that my predecessors here were discussing, especially in improving the conditions in order to make them sort of normal for everyday living. And the best energy that I felt was the energy given by, let's say, young people, whereby there are more people in schools, young people in schools, more women who are educated, and their future lies in the new generations, just as the future of the Balkans lies in the new generations. But what we as an international community have to do is to give them a chance. And in order to give them a chance, we have to have a stable Afghanistan, we have to improve the economy in Afghanistan by joint efforts. And in order to have stable Afghanistan, as my predecessors have said, there are 3 key issues, preconditions. The first one refers to Afghanistan itself. I would like to congratulate their security forces on excellently administered presidential elections, and in 15 days or so I do not doubt that the other election round will be done or administered in a similar way. And what works for them and what is the key issue is to have a peaceful transition of power, to have the leadership of Afghanistan ready to face the new challenges, and to have them ready to cooperate with the international community to decisively fight corruption and organized crime, and be ready to establish the legal state and democracy, the rule of law and democracy. The other issue refers to the international community and to the extent to which it will be ready to walk in the steps of what we have done for working on the establishment of the secure and stable Afghanistan, because without the overall support of the international community it will not be happening. And the third issue that my colloquiators here have discussed is the very important role of the region, first of all of Pakistan and Iran, of course. As far as the transition to the new mission and the completion of the ISAF mission are concerned, and the completion of the ISAF mission is something probably the General most draw upon, it is the signature of SOFA agreement and security agreement, and we hope that this will happen as soon as possible. And the good thing is that the text has been harmonized at the level of NATO, and that both presidential candidates have shown their readiness to start the negotiations. And therefore we hope that once the new president comes into office, we hope in Afghanistan that at the latest in September we'll be having the signing of the necessary agreements, whereby we will be ready to start planning and executing the new mission. Of course, there are a lot of things to be done in order to define the plans for the new mission. However, you know that we have been preparing the zero option, and that is in the case of the possible withdrawing all the forces, but we hope that it will not happen. Of course, within the implementation of the new mission, there will be many challenges ahead of us, and as you know, so far a significant troop withdrawal mission has been going on as planned and has been realized very successfully, and for the time being we have about 44,000 troops in Afghanistan, and the new mission, in line with the political guidelines, should be around 12,000 troops, and that this all should be realized by the end of the current year. Of course, we all need time to have all of our individual parliaments reach a decision on the participation, because the mission's mandate is being changed, and therefore it is very important to have some agreement signed ASAP. Of course, the challenges, as you know, are numerous ones, and very often it happens that the politicians' decisions are not what the commanders need in the field, I have to say. Because once, as you know, when you reach political decisions, you do not take too much into consideration the situation in the fields. Very often politicians are under the pressure of the general public, of the election, of the current momentum and everything that has been going on. And although you know that the political guidelines had been reached, for example, a long time before the situation in the field happens in practice, and you know that at that point somehow our hands are bound. You cannot do much, and that there will be a lot of gaps that you have to fill in. And although this is not a combat mission, this is not going to be a combat mission as of the 1st of January, and although the Afghanistan security forces have to a great level improved their capabilities, there will be a lot of things, especially in the air support, in the intelligence, medical support, logistics plannings, and so on, to be done, where the Afghan forces and coalition forces will have to work jointly, and coalition forces will have to give a great support in those areas to the Afghan forces. As far as Montenegrin participation is concerned, I would like to say that our participation in Afghanistan, although you know that in Montenegro, not only in Montenegro, but in other countries, there are always dishes as to how many people are for, how many people are against the participation, and what do we do in Afghanistan at all, for Christ's sake, because it is so far in terms of distance from Montenegro. Then the other question actually should be asked. Take a look at how many refugees you had last year in Montenegro, how many refugees you had in Serbia. For example, you had them doubled, their numbers doubled compared to the previous years, and they come from those dissolved countries, and therefore the international community has to help the countries resolve the problems within their own borders. And going to Afghanistan for Montenegrin forces helped us improve our capabilities, our capacities. And I say that for my officers, I could not have found a better school than working at the Regional Northern Command. What they learn in 6 months of practical training there, you cannot get it by learning from the books in any other school. And we had a triple benefit. We helped Afghanistan, first of all, to improve their own capacities of their own security forces. The second of all, we improved our own capacities and our own capabilities. And the third issue is that we had many regional projects that we were working on, which significantly improved the cooperation and the trust of all of us, among all of us in the region. And in the forthcoming new mission, as you know, for the time being, we are participating in force protection forces for providing security to the Marmal camp together with Croatia. And in the new mission, we will continue our task together with the armed forces of Croatia, whereby within A5 initiative we are trying, apart from the joint project we had with establishing the police school in Kabul, to try to draw another project in order to join, to participate and to join it jointly, because we all have a lot of benefits, and we are ready to participate in the new mission together with our partners, especially with Croatia, leading nation there, Germany, to try to reconsider and consider all the opportunities as to which task we could undertake as Montenegrin forces. We will definitely continue to participate in the Regional North Command, but we also have been considering the possibility to participating in the counseling teams and providing security to those teams. However, the final word will have to be given by our parliament, because the parliament will have to reach a new decision once we know all the circumstances surrounding the potential new mission.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I think this was a very clear answer to my question, so thank you very much. And we will now continue a little bit with the future of troops after 2014, and I'll turn to my next speaker. Only 2 days ago, President Obama revealed the long-awaited plan for Afghanistan, announcing that a residual force of 9,800 US troops will remain in Afghanistan after 2014. The number will be cut in half at the end of 2015, and in 2016 there will be a small military presence, mainly at the US, around the US embassy in Kabul. Now, there were immediately some reactions from experts, from some politicians. There were several Republican senators who wrote a joint statement or letter saying that it's probably not the best approach. Setting an arbitrary date is maybe not the best for an operation which is a training operation, so you need to see progress and result of your forces that you are training rather than setting a fixed date. So as a professor of security studies at the United States Maronkova Command and Staff College, what's your view?
First of all, I need to thank those countries that have sent students to Command and Staff College and to Marine Corps University. They are competent, they have wonderful capabilities, they have great courage, and they give the Marines a run for their money, which I love watching. So thank you very much for letting me, or for the Marine Corps letting me be a part of that. I'm going to answer your question a little bit of circuitous route, if that's all right, because it also relates to the United States foreign policy decisions about NATO enlargement, and the future of American foreign policy in general. And as an academic, we're famous for saying things that everybody knows anyway, but saying them in a different way. So my first comment is that after war, there's a war weariness, as there should be, and countries and peoples should ask, was it worth it? What war is too important to be left to warriors? I'm sorry. This is a social problem. It's a country problem. It's a world problem. What is worth a man's life to die for their country? And should that country reassess their foreign policy and their foreign defense policy? And after a war, it's the perfect time to do so. Part of that shows up in budget realignments. I wouldn't worry too much about that. Right now, it looks like the United States budget will go back to what was in 1987, which is hardly an evisceration of the defense policy and defense budget. Secondly, there's always a need to do a lessons learned. If we've been in Afghanistan for 10 years, what have we learned about that, and what can and what we should do better? And the first one, I think, is what some of you perhaps should have taught us a long time ago, or perhaps we should have learned, and that's that security is, or human security, is economic, it's political, it's social, it's military, it's environmental, it's all of those things, and to have military, operational, tactical success does not mean security for a country. It has to be a package deal. And that's hard for a military to learn because they need to be competent at what they do as far as military capabilities are concerned, but it's important at the strategic level to make sure that at the end of a war that those kinds of human securities are solidified so that war will have been worth it in the long term, and you don't have to go back and refight it in the past 10 or 20 years. Problems need to be at least advanced, if not solved at some level. That's a very American viewpoint of that. I understand that we can solve problems, but we hope that Afghanistan is better off than it was before the ISAF troops came. And without that belief that we made progress, then we really would have to do an entirely different kind of reassessment. And the first three speakers have said there has been that kind of progress, so I'm quite encouraged. The second is that the end of war is always messy. No matter what happens at the end of the war, we have 5 or 6 stages of warfare. Phase 5 is always a case of random between contractors and criminals, and people coming up from the fringes to say, I had a role in this, please let me play now in the political arena. Those kinds of things are a different kind of warfare than they were during Phase 3 or during the hotter phases of the operations. Those are difficult to contend with, and Afghanistan, unfortunately, has to do that basically by themselves. The United States State Department still has Afghanistan on a list of failed states, and whether or not that is a political statement or whether those are actual measurements, I'll leave you to decide for yourself. But anyway, they're at some level, there has been progress, but it still has to be continued and has to be supported. Then the question that you asked about the future of American foreign and defense policy, there's a lot has been made about the United States movement towards the Pacific. We've always been in the Pacific. We have a Pacific coast. This is not a movement. We're not going anyplace. So the institutions that are involved with NATO and Latin America, Asia, APEC, and the Middle Eastern institutions will continue to be supported, but they may not be at the center of attraction anymore. I think one of my major learning episodes in the last couple of years was at ISAF headquarters. Standing there in front of the headquarters buildings and looking up at the flags, only one of them had green in it, and that was the Afghan flag. And that alerted me to the idea again that if security is indeed a global issue at all of the levels that we've talked about, then we need to be more inclusive in our choice of allies and alliances and make sure that the people that we are fighting with, that we are also fighting for. The idea of my last point, very last point, is that one of the things the Marine Corps has taken on and that I definitely admire is the idea of leading from behind. That you don't need to be in front of the pack, you don't need to even be right next to a person to show leadership characteristics and to work with people rather than simply for them. And working with people is, I want to say, even a biblical principle, because they say if two walk together, how can they disagree? You walk together, you go the same direction, and you may accomplish the same goals in that respect. So, thank you.
Thank you. And if I may keep you still for
Just-
one more question before I
want the
turn
numbers.
to the audience. So please start thinking about your questions. 1 second, Julian. I'll just go back to Pauletta. You mentioned a green flag, right? Did I hear you
Yes, it was
correctly?
the Afghan flag.
The Afghan flag. Well, there is another green flag, and that's the Pakistani. So what's your view?
At
on
the time I
Afghan-
was there, that was not up.
I
So,
mean,
yeah, at that time.
but there's also a green flag in the neighborhood, and that's the Pakistani flag.
in the neighborhood.
What's your view, and Ambassador already touched on it, and also General Allen, Pakistani-Afghani relations in the future?
Did I have a target here somewhere?
Excuse me?
Sorry. All border areas that are contentious, particularly mountain borders. I'm speaking like an academic in security studies, and I teach counterinsurgency for the Marine Corps. All mountain areas are more difficult than non-mountain areas. Montenegro knows that. As I drove past the airport, I thought, this is great counterinsurgency territory. You could hide a lot of people in those valleys, right? So even if there weren't political and ideological boundaries there are areas for people to hide out and move back and forth the boundaries, back and forth across those borders, and do things that are not appreciated by either one of the governments. Those two governments will have to agree on how to handle that border, and no one from the outside can do anything to change that. Now, the idea that there is a similar ethnic group living on both sides of that border makes it easier and harder. If that group decides to take that on as a challenge for themselves, to control the border, to control the movement of goods and services that may or may not be legal, if they take that on, bingo, we've got success. If it has to be done by the central governments, it will be far more difficult because putting troops that are not of that ethnic group into that area will define some sort of intense battlefield and some catastrophe that will not be stopped easily.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'll go to the audience now. Julian?
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, right there. Very good. Great panel. Thank you all. John, this is a question for you, if I may. First question concerns the letter you might write to the NATO heads of state and government about the continuing mission. What would be your major points to them? And the second concerns the training mission itself. I wrote a report a couple of years ago. Much of it was based on standing outside CAF, talking to a couple of NCOs who were doing the training. And they complained that they were getting conflicting training from the Kabul Military Training Center, and in many ways they had to start the effort all over again when they got down to Kandak level. How do we maintain a clear unity of effort and purpose and momentum in the improvement of the ANA and the Afghan National Police?
Thank you. Perhaps we give a couple of minutes
Sure.
To General Allen to think about his letter. Fabrizio, please. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Mr. Ekelen.
Willem van Ekelen from the Netherlands. This has been a very military discussion, and I would like to bring in a slightly different angle. In the first place, I've always been surprised how we got involved in Afghanistan. If the Afghan government and Taliban at that time had delivered Osama bin Laden to an international court, we would never have gone to Afghanistan because it was completely foreign in our planning. And now we are in it for 13 years. And what surprises me in the context is that only the United States and NATO members and a few others are prepared to send soldiers there and make sacrifices. The countries of the region do nothing. You have mentioned Pakistan. Pakistan and India are fighting for influence in Kabul. All the other neighboring countries are not doing anything and certainly nothing helpful. Now, is that a good perspective? And what can we do internationally to improve the situation in Afghanistan to such an extent that the people say we are better off now than we were before? Well, obviously, we haven't reached that stage yet. Otherwise, Obama would not have agreed to be there until 2016. But what should be done more? And can we also, as non-US members of NATO and members of European Union, should we do more? But not militarily.
Thank you. If you could kindly pass the microphone to Fabrizio.
Thank you. Notwithstanding, my question is for General Allen, and I would like to say, notwithstanding the fact that ISAF mission was not conceived officially from the very beginning as a counterterrorism mission, neither an Article 5 one, of course, as General Allen was mentioning, one of the first duty of this operation was to block terrorism and to avoid Afghanistan to be a platform for terrorists. However, in this respect, ISAF was able to establish in this extraordinary environment of Afghanistan an extraordinary network of intelligence that, of course, will collapse with the withdrawal of our troops at the end of 2014. So what we should do to keep the same level of information and to maintain what we achieved there, and in order to avoid that Afghanistan could become in the future again a breeding ground for terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can now go once again. We'll go to answer the first round of the 3 questions, General Allen, and then depending on the time, we might have time for one more, and I've seen a hand up there, but we will now first look at the 3 questions. General.
Well, I always prefer to have Julian somewhere on the panel with me than in the audience in front of me. We've probably spent too much time together in this regard. The letter I would write to the Secretary General first would be to congratulate him and congratulate the nations, not just the 28 nations of NATO, but the 22 partner nations, many of whom contributed enormous numbers of troops and blood and treasure for all that they have accomplished. I'm going to hit in a moment the question about this discussion appearing to have a military-only relevance. What I would say is in the post-2014 period, the resolute support period, every nation that contributes has to be ready to play. Every nation that goes to Afghanistan in the post-2014 period, given the fact that these numbers are not capped per se, but we have a general altitude, if you will, of the size of the force that's going to Afghanistan. And in general, if you're going to go play, you need to do one of three things. You need to be a trainer, you need to be actively guarding the basing platform on which NATO will exist, or you need to be responsible for the safe movement of our trainers back and so movement protection, force protection, or training. We just don't have any room in the force structure anymore for anything other than that. With regard to standards, that has been a problem. It's been a problem throughout the entire mission. If we were to turn the time back to the beginning of the mission, I think we would probably have spent a lot more time ensuring that we all agreed on the training standards ultimately that we would administer to the Afghans as they were emerging as a police force and an army. So we did have some dissonance, and the training didn't suffer necessarily from quality, it was simply different national approaches. So if one nation had responsibility for doing a particular function of training, sometimes it seemed to be in contradiction to what another nation might be undertaking. I think we ultimately solved that, but it took us too long to get to that point. And so in future coalitions that have as a major portion of its mission a training function, I think it's extraordinarily important at the very beginning of this that we all agree on the training standards, conditions, and outcomes that we expect from the indigenous force as we bring it up to speed. One of the things that, in fact, the Chief of Defense from Croatia made this point to me on a number of occasions when I would see him in the battle space. The ISAF accomplished a lot of things, and we can list them all day, and I'm going to hit a couple of them here in just a moment at a political level. But one of the things that the ISAF mission did for NATO was it accelerated years and years faster the interoperability of our forces than we could ever have imagined. And if we had ultimately agreed to create an ISAF uniform, for example, and we set aside everybody's national camouflage, we went to an ISAF uniform, I spent a lot of time with the forces involved under the many different flags that were serving in Afghanistan. And what it really impressed me was how much we all looked alike, how much we all talked alike, and how much we all represented in so many ways the values of NATO. One particular example I had was the evening we were doing a major special operation raid to recover some Afghans and a couple of British subjects. And the SAS force was literally moving onto the objective, and we were in my combat operations center. We were watching it full motion video. This was the moment of truth. And this SAS unit had been inserted, had gone a long way overland over some extraordinarily difficult terrain, and it was about to close with the enemy to liberate these people. And I was struck. It was 3 in the morning or so. We'd been at this now for several days. I looked around the Combat Operations Center at that point, and there were probably 10 different uniforms, 10 different flags on the shoulders. There wasn't an iota of difference between any of us at that moment. And it occurred to me, I was struck by the fact that if NATO ever stood for something, this is the outcome that we would all desire. That we stand for something together, that we are perhaps imperceptible in our differences when the time comes to put the uniform on and execute the NATO military mission. And so we accelerated years and years into the future the opportunity for all of us together, Shona Bashona, shoulder to shoulder with our Afghan partners, the military sophistication, the professionalization of our forces, and all of the things that come from fighting together in the battlefield. And to Albania, I had the great honor in 1995 of training Albanian special forces. That was a long time ago for your country. I served with Albanian special forces at Spin Buldak, a very tough area. I could not believe how far they had come in that period of time. And if they'd have put American Green Berets on, I couldn't have told the difference. They were just magnificent. This is what has happened to NATO, frankly, and I'm not sure we fully appreciate how far we have all come together and what 10 or 11 years of war have done for us, not just for the Afghans. But to the question about this being a military subject or a military discussion, you know, one of the ways that you can measure ultimately the social advance of any particular society is life expectancy. And when life expectancy goes up, it's because children survive childbirth and mothers are able to give birth in an environment where medical care is present. Where life expectancy goes up, it's because we have better educated a population. Where life expectancy goes up, it shows that human rights matters and the rule of law matters. And in the period of time that ISAF has carried the torch on this battlefield on behalf of Afghanistan, and now Afghanistan carrying it on behalf of itself, the life expectancy of an Afghan has gone from about 48 years to between 60 and 62 years. That's incredible. Very few states in this community of nations achieve that level of increase in life expectancy, and some supposedly developed states are in fact shrinking in their life expectancy. Women now play a major role in the society. The literacy is going up, access to health care is going up, the institutions of governance and government are being strengthened. There is a sense, according to the ambassador, and of course I believe this as well, there is a sense of support for the military, but even more importantly, a sense of support for the police, who were as predatory as they were anything else with the population of Afghanistan, and that's changing. There is a free Afghan media that many countries would be envious of. In fact, I think President Karzai was often sometimes sorry about the freedom of the Afghan media. None of that would have been possible, frankly, without the secure platform that was created by ISAF, without the sacrifices of the individual states in this room, without the sacrifices of the men and women in uniform, and without the sacrifices of the Afghan National Security Forces, to create that platform upon which then so much in terms of political, social, and soon to be, hopefully, economic development will occur. With the security provided by ISAF, frankly, all things are possible in Afghanistan's future. Without that security, we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. And so while we have discussed this at a military level, the reality is the political, economic, and social advances in Afghanistan have been enormous given the sacrifices of NATO. And then finally, with regard to intelligence, part of, frankly, the planning that I was undertaking with respect to the withdrawal and the return of our forces, withdrawal is not the right term, but the downgrade of our forces, was in fact preserving as much as possible the intelligence platform. And as you, I'm sure, are aware, we had a number of bases and installations that benefited from our military platform. It sat on top of them. And so as we are drawing down our military platform, we also are very, very careful to do what we can to preserve the intelligence platform as well. But just as we are transitioning NATO from a force in the lead to a force in advice and ultimately a force in training, we're doing the same thing with the Afghan intelligence services as well. One of the most difficult aspects for development of any new army is developing an intelligence service within that army. We've been blessed that Afghanistan has a G2 with extraordinarily, G2 being a general intelligence officer at the top, with extraordinary capabilities. He served as a general officer and an intelligence officer in the National Directorate for Security in the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense. He's really exceptional, and he is bringing online the military intelligence capabilities. We've got much more work to do there. Also, the National Director of Security has come a very long way from the days it was called the HUD, and it struck fear and terror into the hearts of any Afghan who heard that word. Today, the NDS is a legitimate intelligence service, which not only is very strong in the area of human intelligence, it's also perfecting, frankly, quite a sophisticated signals intelligence capability as well. It's nascent. It's in its very earliest stages. But we have to balance the drawdown of our intelligence apparatus and intelligence platform with the development of an Afghan capability, and then ensure the long-term partnership as well. It will be one of the most difficult challenges for us in the time ahead.
Thank you. Minister and then others, if they'd like to comment on any of the questions, please.
Well, I really liked the question of if we were trying to put bin Laden under the Hague court, what was the other story? I think that this was not a question of bin Laden. Bin Laden find the right, let's say, platform to build up its castle there and its mission. We call it the Tora Bora one or something else, it doesn't matter. Because after 30 years of nonsense wars and fightings within Afghanistan, this was one of the right places to do the wrong thing. So it's not for me, it's not a question of bin Laden putting in jail. It's the question of Afghani people. And the platform, because the platform of that time was the land of growing up puppies and terrorism. And this was not good for the safeness of the country, for the safeness of the countries around Afghanistan, for the safeness of the whole world. So we agreed to be part of that important mission named ISAF. And we agree to be part of the post-ISAF mission just because we care that this platform, it's not the best, the worst platform, the fertile land of growing up terrorism and puppies, it's not going to be the platform of the future of Afghan people. So after all what we have done, we really do feel much more safe. Hague or not Hague. Thank you.
Thank you. Any else from the audience? So may I suggest I take one last question from the young gentleman and we'll wrap up.
Thank you for being granted the right to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bijan, I'm from the Netherlands. And it is my opinion that as a friend, a true friend, you should also be critical at moments that that's necessary. And I feel compelled to take that role, perhaps for a few seconds, if you allow me to do so. With regards to what Mr. van Ekelen said earlier on, that the nations in the region don't take responsibility, don't contribute troops. We should not forget that Pakistan actually did contribute troops, Pakistan, our ally, but on the wrong side of the war. They contributed tens of thousands to the Taliban, they helped them, they trained them, and they still do so, certain contingents within the Pakistani government. That being said, what I find interesting is that when this discussion of the future of Afghanistan is being held here in other fora, the general consensus is that Pakistan plays a key role in the future of Afghanistan. Everyone agrees. I think everyone on the panel also said that. Taking this back to the previous panel, Ukraine and Russia, if one dares to suggest the same vis-à-vis Russia and Ukraine, then I think everyone in this chamber is unanimous that that's a ridiculous idea. Now, I understand that Pakistan obviously is a long-standing partner and ally of NATO, of the United States, but considering the role that it has played in Afghanistan, why is it so natural to say that the future of Afghanistan requires Pakistan, domestically speaking, but when we speak of Ukraine, then Russia is out of the picture? That's a ridiculous idea. It's just a thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody wants to take on this last one?
I'll respond. He is part of the young leaders So this is another opportunity where the young leaders play an important role in this overall forum. And he asked me a question similar to this, a very challenging question the other day. And again, if young leaders are challenging us with the way we're thinking, then I think the program is successful. I believed years ago, and I was doing Afghanistan and Pakistan from 2008 on, frankly. I believed years ago, frankly, that the peace in Afghanistan would only occur if the road carried you through Rawalpindi and Islamabad. I no longer believe that, frankly. Pakistan has a large number of very serious structural problems right now. And people who've been watching Pakistan for many years have been clear that Pakistan has been able to generally handle them in sequence. The lowest per capita revenue generation rate of any developed country. An electrical grid that's flat on its back, a budgetary system which is pernicious in its deficit spending, a military that is sorely beset either on the line of contact with India or in the high ground of the federally administered tribal areas. Corruption, the presence of extremist elements that are of an enormous threat, and separatist elements in virtually every province. And then sits on top of the fastest growing nuclear arsenal of any country in the world. So Pakistan is now suffering many of these challenges simultaneously. And I have come to believe that a stable, democratic, prosperous Afghanistan can do more ultimately in the long term to help Pakistani stability than the other way around. And this is going to be a very heavy lift. This was the reason why in my humble letter to the President-elect that Afghanistan and Afghanistan as an ally with the West do all we can, frankly, to stabilize Pakistan, because the alternative to a stable Pakistan is almost unimaginable for all of us in this room, not just for Afghanistan. And so it's really important that we have a clear mind or a clear eye on the challenges that Pakistan is facing today and what can be done to help to stabilize Pakistan and to make it a player in the region for the stability of the region and ultimately a consumer of stability. Now, just one layer out from Pakistan is China. And the Pakistanis would say that China is their all-weather friend, and I don't dispute that. But China, I think, has also an important role to play in the region. A different role than, say, Russia would, but an important role nonetheless. And when we consider Pakistan's role with regard to Afghanistan, it's also important to think about what role China may have with regard to Afghanistan, and in that process, what sorts of relationships we can create to the stability of Pakistan, to the engagement of China in areas where we have common interests, potentially common values, to enhance the stability of the region. Pakistan deserves our attention, and Pakistan deserves the efforts of the states represented in this room and the more generally the international community to do what we can to stabilize Pakistan. And you're right, there are areas along the frontier, whether you call it the Soviet border or the Pakistani border or the Durand line, whatever you want to call it, and my apologies to my Afghan counterpart here if we're calling it the Durand line. I know it's not the border. But there are insurgent elements that did, in fact, receive significant benefit from being on the eastern side of that line. And I'm not entirely clear now whether those insurgent benefits can receive enough attention from Pakistan at some point, ultimately, to reduce their virulence with regard to Afghanistan. I worry about that. It's the old saying about if you unleash enough snakes in your backyard with regard to your neighbor, sooner or later you're going to get bitten by one of those snakes. And that's in fact the case now, where the Haqqanis are operating in the settled areas in the Punjab, where the TTP, Tariq-i-Taliban Pakistan, and the Lashkar-e-Taiba, they are now operating, in fact, in the settled areas, where in fact there had never been any expectation by Pakistani leadership that that would happen. So it's in our interests. It's in our interest to do what we can for Pakistan, but not sacrifice our investment in Afghanistan to do that. That's why the new president of Afghanistan, I think, has to begin the process of a dialogue, a constructive, multi-layer, multifaceted dialogue with Pakistan, supported by the West and encouraged by the West, and encouraged by the Chinese and the Indians to see if we can solve this.
I'm sorry, Ambassador, one last point, please. You have
well,
to
thank you
wrap
very
up.
much, General. You mentioned a very important issue here, and actually the question is very complicated and very old. The crux of the problem is can be discussed in two parts. One, the tremendous structural problems that unfortunately have grown over time inside Pakistan. And then there is another problem with regard to Afghanistan, and that is the so-called Durand Line, which was drawn in 1893 and separated the Pashtuns into, divided the Pashtun land between Pakistan, then British India and Afghanistan. And that line has been very controversial, and it involves a lot of emotional issues. Unfortunately, it's beyond politics. It's the relationship between the two parts of the same people on the two sides of the line. And another problem that I see is the traditional fear and paranoia that unfortunately Pakistan seems to have with its experience with India. The 3 or 4 wars that Pakistan lost has put Pakistani strategists, politicians, and military in a very paranoid mood, and that continues. Whenever Afghanistan tries to have better relations with India, which is a big power or a big regional power in the region, and also historically we have had very strong ties, cultural, economic, and political ties. Whenever Afghanistan has tried to have friendly relations or extensive relations with India, Pakistan has seen this as a threat to its own strategic interests. So both sides, as the General mentioned, not only Afghanistan but also Pakistan should work on both of these two main obstacles that exist in the area of rapprochement and friendship between the two countries. Afghanistan is totally dependent, almost 80% dependent in terms of its transit to the international market on Pakistan. And we have to work out our problems, but of course it takes, in our language, it takes 2 hands to clap, not one. One hand cannot clap. So hopefully Pakistan will be able, as Pakistan grows and improves its economy and becomes democracy becomes more mature in both countries, I think the road to a political dialogue between the two countries will be paved. Until that day, we will have a little press skirmishes and all sorts of. But my advice to everybody in my own country is that I come from an old generation, and I have learned some old adages. In our country, we say that the wound caused by the tongue is much worse than the wound caused by the sword. We should lower our rhetoric and be more careful and more subtle in our dealings. Unfortunately, since it's a matter of of the same people on the two sides, it becomes very emotional. Actually, my grandfather is buried in Peshawar, and my grandfather was the governor of Peshawar, run from Kabul. So it becomes emotional,
Very,
but we
very
have to
emotional,
have that behind us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. I'm sorry we are running out of time. I think it was a really fascinating debate. We could go on and on, especially continuing in this regional aspect, but I'm afraid we have no more time. I would like to, as the Ambassador said, clap both hands to our panel, to you, and thank you for being with us. Thank you.